If you walked into a Catholic cathedral in 1200 and then walked into a king's court, you'd have trouble telling the difference. One man at the top, advisors arranged by rank, authority flowing downward. That's not a coincidence. And it didn't start in the Middle Ages. It started with a man writing letters in chains on his way to be executed. His name was Ignatius of Antioch. Around 110 CE, this bishop, prisoner, and soon-to-be martyr drew the first org chart for the Christian church. To understand what Ignatius built, we need to see what came before. In Paul's world, early Christianity was a loose network of house churches, small gatherings in private homes scattered across the Mediterranean. Paul, the most influential early leader, held no title, no appointment, no diploma. His authority rested on a single claim: I saw the risen Jesus. Scholars call this charismatic authority, power rooted in personal experience and force of personality, not institutional rank. These house churches stayed connected through letters and traveling emissaries, not through a chain of command. There was no hierarchy, no pyramid, no organizational chart. Different communities operated differently. Leadership was fluid. If you had a vision, if you could prophesy, if people trusted you, that was your credential. It worked. For a generation, it worked. But it couldn't last. By the time Ignatius writes, roughly 50 years after Paul's death, something fundamental has changed. In his letter to the Trallians, chapters 2 and 3, Ignatius lays out a structure no one before him had articulated with this clarity. At the top, the bishop presiding over all churches in a city or region. Beneath the bishop, the presbyters, a Greek word meaning elders, a council that would eventually evolve into the priesthood. At the base, the deacons, serving in practical and the liturgical roles. Earlier texts do mention these titles. The pastoral epistles refer to bishops, presbyters, and deacons. But no one before Ignatius organized them into a formal ranked pyramid with clear lines of authority flowing from top to bottom. He drew the first organizational chart for the Christian church, and then he did something even more consequential. He made that chart sacred. Ignatius mapped each church office onto a divine figure. The bishop corresponds to God the Father, the presbyters correspond to the apostles, the deacons correspond to Jesus Christ. In his letter to the Magnesians, he wrote, "The bishop is to be regarded as the Lord himself." This wasn't just administration, it was cosmology. Challenging the bishop meant challenging God's own order. But here's the critical nuance. Historians believe Ignatius was inflating the power these offices held. Other documents from the same period show bishops and presbyters without this kind of sweeping authority. Ignatius wasn't describing reality. He was building it, using his status as a martyr in transit to promote and legitimize a still new institutional structure. Now, for the deeper puzzle, not why this hierarchy existed, but why it took this specific shape, a pyramid. The answer isn't in theology, it's in geography. Right? Ignatius lived inside the Roman Empire, and his hierarchy maps almost exactly onto the structure of a Roman law court. In a Roman court, a judge, the presiding magistrate, sat at the top with ranked subordinate officials beneath, assessors, clerks, attendants. The bishop is the judge. The presbyters and deacons are the court staff. Christianity didn't just grow inside Rome, it grew into the shape of Rome. Ignatius reinforced this parallel in practice. He insisted that interpreting scripture must be done in agreement with the bishop, not independently. His reasoning was practical. Any text can be made to say anything, but the mechanism is identical to how Roman legal authority worked. Centralized ruling authority prevents fragmentation. One judge, one ruling, one interpretation. What Ignatius started in the 2nd century, the church scaled up over the next 1,000 years. By the Middle Ages, the pattern had amplified dramatically. The Pope functioned like an emperor, elected not by the people but by cardinals, themselves appointed by previous popes. Bishops received their positions from the Vatican, not from local congregations. Power flowed from the top, and the Pope sat surrounded by a court of cardinals and bishops, just as the king sat surrounded by nobles and advisors. This wasn't a corruption of the original model. It was the same mirroring principle operating at a larger political scale. The Reformation didn't just challenge Catholic theology, it reflected a political revolution. Across Europe, the rise of the bourgeoisie, the decline of aristocracy, the emergence of republican government. The Dutch Republic, and the first fully modern republic without a monarchy, and eventually the US Constitution provided new political templates. Protestant churches adopted constitutional governance, elected bodies, governing documents, shared authority. They claim to be returning to the biblical model. But the organizational forms they chose were strikingly contemporary to 16th through 18th century political innovation. Step back and the pattern becomes unmistakable. Across 2,000 years, Christian organizational structures have consistently mirrored the political systems of their surrounding societies. Ignatius mirrored the Roman Empire's centralized provincial administration. Medieval Catholicism mirrored the feudal monarchy. Reformation Protestantism mirrored the emerging republics and democracies of early modern Europe. This is not a one-time event. It's a recurring law of institutional development. Churches don't exist outside of politics. They are shaped by politics, especially when they claim divine origin for their structures. Every generation of Christians has looked at the political world around them and, consciously or not, built their churches in that same image. If every generation of Christians has unconsciously replicated the political structures around them, the implication extends to the present. The churches people sit in today mirror some political form, and most wouldn't recognize it if they saw it. That's the legacy of Ignatius of Antioch. A man in chains writing letters on his way to execution in Rome. He didn't describe what the church was. He imagined what it could become, and he imagined it in the image of the empire that was about to kill him. Those letters shaped the organizational DNA of the world's largest religion, not through theology alone, but through the quiet, powerful logic of institutional imitation.